This is how I color to go from this to this. Disclaimer, I'm not a professional artist, so don't leak my house address if I mess up anything. When I first started digital art, I could not color to save my life. I mean, it's not downright terrible, but there's a lot that could be improved upon. The colors are very bleak, and Shoko looks dead inside. Leading up to this first digital painting I made though, I'd already spent a lot of years learning black and white traditional graphite pencil art and attending weekly art classes. This meant that I at least had the grasp of the fundamentals of art, and so as I learned the ins and outs of digital art, I found myself improving pretty quickly. And that brings me to a point, which is that before you go ahead and color, you first need to understand value. So what is value? When we talk about value in art, we're not talking about how much something is worth. To put it simply, value is how light or dark something is, ranging from pure white to pure black. Understanding how value works when you're coloring is important because it's what allows you to go from this, your base paints, to this. The main factor that determines value on the surface of an object is light. Take a look at this circle again. Now I'm going to remove some layers and simplify it for now. We know that the source of light is coming from here because the other part of the sphere is covered in shadow, which means that significantly less light is hitting it. It also casts a shadow onto the table because the sphere is blocking the light from shining on that specific part of the table. Now yes, I know it gets more complicated than this, but I'll get to all that later. Step 1. Base colors. Coming back to a painting, let's fill in the base colors. Now you don't want them to be the brightest part of your painting, nor do you want them to be the darkest part, so somewhere in the middle of those two. Oh wait, what's that? Middle? So this part right here is your midtones, and this is the kind of brightness that you want to be going for your base colors. Now you can see here that although it's exposed to light, it isn't the brightest part of the object. That is. And we'll get to that later, don't worry. And here is my painting with the base colors finished. Let's move on. Step 2. Shadows. This whole general section right here is the shadow. You can see that there's different parts to it. Some parts are darker, some parts are brighter. But if that's the shadow, then what's this? This part is called a cast shadow because it's not actually part of the sphere. It's a specific part of the table where light has been obstructed by the sphere. Or in other words, the sphere is casting a shadow onto the table. So when we start painting our initial shadows, we need to think about two things. The first one is where light can't directly reach because of the shape of the object and the direction of the light. And we also need to think about places that would be lit up, but currently their exposure to the light has been obstructed by another object. For simplicity's sake, I like to move down the color box diagonally when I'm painting my base shadows. But for a more in-depth explanation of how colors affect shadows, check out the link in the description. Another thing you might notice is that I'm actually tinting the hue of my shadows just a little, and this adds some variance to my colors. Another thing about laying down your initial shadows is please don't use an airbrush. I know it's tempting, I know it feels more comfortable not having to make a distinct boundary between, alright, this is light, this is going to be shadow. But if you over rely on the airbrush, you're going to end up with a painting that has a plasticky feel, it's very monotonous, and it lacks clarity. You can see that in real life there's a mixture of hard and soft shadows. Even in stylized artworks, there's a combination of soft and hard shadows so that the artist can bring forward their character's form. And if you're familiar with manga or anime at all, you'll know that they only use hard shadows. Now, I'm not saying the airbrush is a bad tool, it's a great tool when it's used properly. But at least for our initial shadows, it's much easier to use a blend brush to blend out a hard shadow than it is if, say, we had a soft blurry shadow and we try to give that a defined edge. Now that we're done with our base shadows, let's move on to the different variations of shadows. Step 3. More shadows. This might seem counterintuitive, but the darkest part of the shadow on this sphere is actually this part. So why is it that this part is the darkest part of the shadow and the bottom is actually slightly lighter? Well, ambient light means the other sources of light in the surroundings of an object. When light hits an object, the light doesn't just disappear. Some of it is absorbed and some of it is reflected and scattered around. Even if your object is not very reflective, like polished metal or a mirror, the light will still get reflected in a noticeable way, especially if two objects are very close. The reason why the underside shadow of the sphere is lighter than, say, the core shadow is because when light hits the table, some of the light bounces back up onto the sphere, and the reason why the core shadow is darker is because there's a greater distance from that part of the sphere to the table, and hence it receives less reflected light. There's one more thing I want to talk about, and it's even darker than the core shadow. This part is your occlusion shadow, and it's the darkest because it's so tucked away that even the bounce light can't really make it in there. Let's have a look at the drawing after step 3. In a daytime setting where there's just simply so much light scattered everywhere, it's probably not going to be completely black, but in a dimly lit room, your occlusion shadows can actually be completely black. Step 4, more lighting. Highlights are the brightest part of your drawing as they are closest to the light source. Highlights should be brighter than your midtones, but whether or not they are more saturated really depends on the lighting scenario. If you have a very harsh white light, say in a studio, then your highlights are going to be less saturated because of that bright light source. But if you're outside on a sunset, then your character is more likely to have a very warm, more saturated highlight. So having a look at my reference, it's most likely set on a very bright sunny day, right? This means that when I start painting the highlights, they're going to be quite desaturated and close to white. Okay, one last thing. So the very last thing I want to talk about is the terminator. Now the terminator is essentially the boundary between the light and the dark part. This is very important to consider when you're drawing skin, because believe it or not, we are all slightly transparent. Don't believe me? This phenomenon that occurs at the terminator is called subsurface scattering. It happens because light can penetrate our skin, and well, what's under our skin? Blood and flesh. And it's the red hue of these parts of our body that get reflected back out. Do note that this subsurface scattering is more subtle for people with dark skin. This is a quick tutorial on how to add subsurface scattering using an overlay clipping mask and a soft brush. Right now I'm using Procreate, but most comprehensive drawing apps should be able to do this. And we're done. You can see I'm using the same overlay process for the bright highlights too. Here's the time lapse from part 3 to part 4. Here's one more extra tip while I play my whole speed paint. My only tip right now is if you're a beginner and you're going to try this process out for the first time, please use a reference. Like, don't even find different references and combine them all together, just use one reference and obsess over that reference and try study as much as you can from it. Like one-to-one replicating what you see, because that is genuinely the fastest way you can improve at this. I know everyone has a different stylization, and it doesn't matter if you choose a real photo or a drawing that you really like from another illustrator, as long as you don't pass it off as your own. Thank you all so much for watching until the end. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.